The Book of Ruth. This is a very short book of the Bible. In my Bible, it's 3 pages long. But it's a story that you probably have heard before, I'm guessing. It's one of the only stories in the Bible that has women as its mostly main characters, women who have names, who talk to each other. I think it passes the Bechdel test. So here's what happens, in case it's been a while since you have read the Book of Ruth. There's a famine in Judah, in Bethlehem, where Naomi and her husband Elimelech live, and they have 2 sons, and there's just no food. So they do what you do when there's no food. They go live somewhere else. Remember we talked about immigration a couple of years ago and how many of our families had come to the United States because there wasn't food at their home? Yeah. So they left their home, they went somewhere else, and their sons grew up and they built a life there, and their sons married some women who lived in Moab, the land that they were from. Now, to the Israelites, this was kind of not great to marry foreigners, but they lived in this other place, and they figured it's probably okay, right? We're here now, and we know these people, and they're good people, and we think that they're gonna fit into our family well. So that's what happens. Everything's like kind of okay, right? Until Ruth's sons get sick, and her husband, and all 3 of the men in their family die. Now this is really, really dangerous for these women. As Charlotte was saying, this is a time when you really needed to have a man in order to survive. You had to be attached to a man's household in order to have the things you need, food and shelter and protection. And so these 3 women were alone, and they were very vulnerable. So Naomi, imagine, she had so much courage and so much strength. She left her home, she started this new life, and then she loses half of her family. Terrible to even imagine, right? And then she says to her daughters-in-law, because she knows if they go with her, there's not a lot of hope. She's not going to have more sons. She tells Ruth, I'm too old, and even if I did have one today, would you wait for him to grow up and then marry him? She's like, if there's nothing for you here, you should go back to your parents' families. They were relatively young widows. They might get married again. There was still some hope for them in Moab. And so one of her daughters-in-law does return to her home. But the other daughter-in-law, Ruth, says, no, I am going to go with you. And she makes this beautiful vow that we sometimes read at weddings: where you go, I will go, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, and takes this huge risk going with this older widow back to Naomi's home, which is a place that Ruth has never visited, and where Ruth, frankly, might not really be welcome. So they go back to their hometown, to Bethlehem. You've heard of Bethlehem, right? And the women are not super excited to see Naomi. She says, in fact, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant or nice. She says, instead, call me Mara, which means bitter, because God has dealt bitterly with me. She's like, I've lost everything, and here I am. So this place of loss and of huge challenges, they try to make a way for themselves. And there was a system in which someone related to you, to your family, could claim the land of your family, could marry a widow in your family, called a kinsman redeemer. And there's an available kinsman redeemer in town, and his name is Boaz. So Naomi asks Ruth to go to Boaz. He's a big farmer, and there's a tradition that people in need can glean from the edges of the crops for free. They can take what they need to eat, and she sends Ruth to do that. Boaz sees her doing this and is kind of like, oh, I've heard you guys are in town. Who knows what happens between them, what kind of chemistry maybe. But he gives Ruth extra grain to take home with her. He tells his own workers to look out for her, and suddenly there's somebody who might protect them again. Now, Naomi instructs Ruth on how to kind of go to Boaz and propose marriage to him, which is very interesting, and they end up together. They get married, and Ruth gets pregnant and has a son. And because they have this son, that means that she and her family will be able to inherit the land of her dead husband and her dead father-in-law, and that Naomi and Ruth will have safety. So that's where we pick up at the very end of the story in chapter 4 of Ruth, verses 13 through 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin. May his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse and the father of David. This is the story of Ruth and the word of God. Thanks be to God. So this book is called Ruth, and so we often understandably think about it in terms of Ruth's experience, of her loyalty and commitment to her mother-in-law, Naomi. We think about the ways that she takes risks to secure their future in a place that she had never been and among people she had never known. But it is also the story of Naomi's experience, and I think there is richness for this moment of our collective lives if we think about the story from the point of view of Naomi, of what her life has been, of what she has lost, and what it is like to try to return, to try to go back after so much has changed. So not for nothing, today is the first day since March 8th, 2020, that we have invited people to gather in person for worship in this building. There's some applause here. We are returning. And much like Naomi, things are not the way that we left them. We are not the same, for one thing, right? We have experienced the pain of this pandemic, loss of those we love, threats to our own health, the frustration of milestones delayed or passed by altogether, the loss of that certainty that we probably falsely held that we could plan for the future. There are hugs, and every contact is tinged with awareness of viruses. There are smiling faces, but only some in the room here with us, the rest coming through us through the miracle of video technology. We have returned to our home, and still, it's not really the same. There's a popular conception about the term resilience. I'm sure you've heard this, that resilience is like a rubber band, that no matter how far it gets stretched, no matter how far we're stretched, we should be able just to bounce back, right? Good as new. Oh, but this metaphor doesn't exactly hold. I don't know about you, but what happens when we're stretched so far that we snap? A better metaphor for resilience, those who work in the field of mental health have told us, is the metaphor of what happens when we break a bone. There's this break, this trauma, right, to the bone, followed by a long period of healing, a period during which, Chris is nodding, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to activate this for you. A period when we have to take it easy, when we have to do things differently, when we have to be extra careful for ourselves. And so resilience is more like this process of healing, and like what happens when the bone heals. Because in the place where it was once broken, it becomes stronger than it was before. Naomi has lived through what is unthinkable. She left her home in the middle of a disaster. She built a new life in a foreign country only to lose her husband and her sons, and with them her hope for survival. She mustered up all of her strength and her courage to do what was right and best for those around her, to tell her daughters-in-law to go home. And then she risks even returning, going back, with the choices that she has made, with the tragedy that she has been through, and with her daughter-in-law, Ruth. When the women of her hometown finally accept her again in that passage that we just read, when her future has been secured by the birth of a grandson, they celebrate with her, saying, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you without next of kin." Friends, blessed be the Lord, who has not left us this day without next of kin. As we tally up the losses, the changes, the pain, the risks of this past 20 months, as we return to something not quite the same as we left it, God has not left us alone. Our community, our connection to one another is stronger perhaps than ever before. It's really interesting, in the Book of Ruth, God never acts or speaks directly in the whole story. Instead, we see God's presence revealed in the interactions between the people in the story. We find God in the connection between Ruth and Naomi that saves them both. God inhabits the connections between all of us too. The connections we share in person, across virtual space, God is in there. And these connections are, in fact, one of the ways that God is at work in the world, the very mechanisms that build God's kingdom. So the story of Naomi and Ruth ends with that little bit of genealogy, telling us that Naomi's grandson Obed will become the father of Jesse, who is the father of David, right? One of the most important people in the Bible. And also then we can extrapolate an ancestor of Jesus. So there is a message of hope here in this short list of names, that even in the midst of change and difference, in the aftermath of loss and despair, hope is always being born. Naomi's journey through the loss, the way that she kept going despite despair, her courage, the way that she didn't give up hope, her, in a word, resilience, are a model to all of us. Even when things seem insurmountably difficult, and we are just wishing we could go back to what once was, Naomi reassures us that everything we actually need to make it through this is right here in the connections around and between us. For everything we have been through these past 20 months, or as different as this day is from March 8, 2020, God has not left us without next of kin, and we can trust that hope will be born once again in our midst. Amen.